Okay, now, before we actually start writing our Redux code, it's going to be a lot of code in a style that we might be unfamiliar with. Even getting started with just writing these reducers might be a bit confusing, so I want to take this time just to show you what each piece will look like before we start writing it so you don't feel overwhelmed with all this new code that we're suddenly writing. Now, let's re-explore our diagram and let's look at our reducers. So reducers are a fundamental part of Redux because they are essentially what our state is represented by. When I say reducer, you can pretty much picture it as an object. And the root reducer is the big object that holds all the smaller objects. So, for example, our home reducer is just an object that holds properties equal to the data that we want related to the home. Anything related to home, right, that we might want to separate in its own object will be in the home reducer. Anything related to the shop, right, maybe all the shop items are going to be in the shop reducer. Anything related to the user, such as the current user or the address or whatever we can imagine with the user, we hold in the user reducer. And they're all just objects. And they all together compose the big object that is our root reducer. And you can visualize it literally as just a big object with a property of home that goes to some object with those home data, right? Home properties. Same thing with the shop. Same thing with the user. And let's say the component wants just the user reducer. Well, we would just pass that slice, right? That object into our component as the property that that component needs. Let's say it is current user. We can just go from the root reducer, get this user object, and even just get that property of current user and pass it into our component. Now, let's say we wanted to update that user the same way that we were doing setState inside of our app.js component. Well, we do that with these things called actions. And what actions are, if we scroll down a little and look at this new diagram, is literally also just an object. It's an object that has a type on it with a string value, and then it has a payload that could be whatever we want it to be. Whatever we want to update that value to, we would just pass that as the payload. So our components will fire these actions, right, with this with a name on it, that take this shape with a type and a payload. That would then go into our reducer, which would then check the type to see whether or not that type of action is applicable to that reducer. Because if we want to update the current user, only the user reducer cares about that action. The home reducer and the shop reducer don't care about it. And the way that it works is that these reducers are going to check against the type, right? Because that string we're just going to match and say, oh, does my reducer care about this type of action? If it does, I want you to update the whatever property it is. In this case, it's the current user property with the payload on that action. So these actions update our user reducers with the payload. And then our user reducer passes that current user in as a prop to the component. And then the component will render however it needs to with the prop. And it will continue to always follow this flow. Let's say the user logs out, right? From our app component, we would then fire that action again. Set current user would be the action. So the type would be set current user. Payload would be null this time because the user logged out. So then our user reducer would update current user with null and then pass that null current user property into our component so that our component can render null as current user or do whatever it wants with it. At that point, our component cares about that property, but our Redux does not. So if we want to look at our reducer code, the way that a reducer looks is every reducer is just a function. The function takes a state and then it takes an action. The state is the previous state that it was in, is the state before this new action is going to update it. So we can even see this as previous or current state. And what we would do is with this function, it's going to return an object. It's going to return an object, and that object is going to be the new state of our user reducer. It's going to be a new object. So what we do to determine that is we use what's called a switch statement. And a switch statement is kind of like a really big if statement. So we're checking the action type, right? Which is that string value we saw here. We're going to check the type. If the case is that action type is set current user, if that's what that string of value of type is, then we're going to return a new object where we are going to just spread in current state, but make sure that the current user property is the payload. And the reason we always return a new object is because we want our components to re-render. As we remember, if we pass in the same old object, except the property is different, our components might not re-render the way we want them to because of the way that React components work. React components only re-render if their props are different. And the only way that the props are different is if the object that it has is new. If we pass the same property, i.e. the same object, but with a different value, like let's say we just passed in a modified version of current state where we instead did current state dot current user equals action dot payload. If we did, action dot payload, if we did this and this is what we returned, that object is not actually different and our component will not re-update. Instead, we have to always remember to render a new object, right, as what we pass. If none of the action types match, then we just want to return current state because we don't want to re-render anything. Because this action does not affect our reducer. Our reducer does not care. The reason for this is because our reducers are listening to every action. And our reducers only change if the type is relevant to it. And we will do that with our code. So remember that. Every reducer is just a function that takes the state and then it takes an action. And then based on the action, it determines whether or not it needs to re-render. And then what it gives out is just going to be the object. And in our case, all it is just a value of current user goes to whatever that payload was. And this is going to be the type of code that we will write inside of our Redux. I just wanted to show you guys this because as we start writing it, there will be a lot of this stuff and I don't want you to be confused as we're building it. Okay, let's start integrating.